Hello and welcome, everybody. This is the International Transport Forum's Ask the Author session on our new report, Safer Micromobility.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends,
Excuse me. You're all very welcome to the session. If it's your first Ask the Author, what we'll do is have a very quick analysis of the issue, the methodology, and the findings of this latest report. From our three lead authors. We're very lucky to have all three of them with us today. That should take about 10 minutes, and then it's your opportunity to ask the questions using the Q&A section on your Zoom window, the question and answer section. So this is our revamp of the Safe Micromobility study, which was done in 2020, at the beginning of this becoming a cutting issue for mobility in all cities. There was a dearth of information at the time. Nevertheless, that report in 2020 became one of the ITF's most read reports. 4 years later, a lot has changed. We have a lot of new data and analysis, which we're going to share with you today. And that's the basis of this new micromobility report. I will put a download link into the chat if you haven't already got the report. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Virginia Petraki and George Yannis from the National Technical University of Athens in Greece, as well as ITF's Philippe Crist. All three of our authors happen to be in Dublin, Ireland today for the Transport Research Arena and committee meetings. So without further ado, I'll pass over to our authors, and then we'll come back for your questions in about 10 minutes' time. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Ronan. As you've just heard, we are going to be talking about our current assessment of the safety of micromobility. Now, at the ITF, we are convinced that safe micromobility is a precondition to be able to achieve or to address and benefit from the potential sustainability, space efficiency, environmental benefits that come from the use of smaller vehicles, two-wheeled, three-wheeled vehicles, electrically powered vehicles, and the kinds of micromobility modes that have been around for more than 100 years, bicycles, tricycles, etc. Safety is a precondition, and so we are reassessing now with the data that we have available to us where we stand on our understanding of the safety of micromobility. When we talk about micromobility, we have at the ITF 66 member countries. Within those countries, there are ways of classifying for homologation purposes different vehicles, but there is no uniform way of classifying micromobility. So we take a different approach. We look at the safe system approach for guidance, and we classify micromobility vehicles according to two parameters that are key in the safe system approach: weight or mass and speed. What we're talking about in this report are going to be vehicles that are weighing less than approximately 35 kilos, and that can travel for some of them up to 25 kilometers per hour in electrically assisted mode, and for others up to 45 kilometers an hour in electrically assisted mode. We do not talk here about batteries and the safety issues relating to batteries, but more in the use of the vehicles themselves. You've heard this is an update of a report back in 2020. In 2020, the most rapid deployment of micromobility vehicles that we've seen in a long time, shared e-scooters, had just really taken over in the last 3 years. And now we're coming back because we have 4 more years of data, 7 years of data in all, to try to assess what we know now about the safety of not just e-scooters, but micromobility in the larger sense. And what we can say is that we do have evidence that micromobility is becoming safer, but we do target, or we do highlight, that an increase in severe injuries from e-scooter crashes is a real cause of concern. When we look at the data that we have available, and data availability is an issue, but when we look at the data that we have available, we can say that for shared e-scooters, the crash risk is decreasing because the usage of those e-scooters is increasing more rapidly than the rate of injuries. That doesn't mean that those injuries are not significant and should be accounted for. It's just that the risk is decreasing because we see a decrease in the exposure of a person using these vehicles to a crash for any given trip or for any given kilometer. What we can also point out is that when we think about safety, especially for these smaller vehicles, we've tended to focus on the riders themselves, but we've emphasize that when we think about safety, we have to look at the environment in which these vehicles are operating. We have to think about infrastructure, but we also have to think about vehicle design. And so these are areas that public authorities have a real responsibility in helping guide, shape, and deliver. And finally, we can take some comfort from the fact that a lot of the pro-safety policies that we already know to be effective and that we are already deploying in many of our cities and many of our areas where we see this increase in the use of micromobility are in fact the ones that are going to deliver safe micromobility. And this is going to be speed management. It's going to be providing the right kind of infrastructure. It's going to be a focus on drink driving or drink riding in this case. Those policies are effective for micromobility safety as well. How do we assess micromobility safety? Well, if we're concerned about crashes in thinking about safety, it's because crashes have a negative impact on health. So we tend to take a step back and say, let's think about health in the larger perspective. So crashes, exposure to air pollution, those are negative impacts on health, but there are certain forms of micromobility, those that are physically active, that contribute greatly to positive health impacts as well. So we frame it in terms of health. Then we look at some of the crash factors or look at the issues relating to crashes. So number of crashes and the number of trips that are taking place. And then when we think about the crashes themselves, we try to look at the different crash causality factors. And that's going to be infrastructures, it's going to be users and riders in the case of micromobility, and it's going to be vehicles. As I said, we look at this broader health perspective, and what we can say is that from a health perspective, active and passive forms of micromobility are not on the same footing. We know that cycling and e-cycling, walking, all of those are very physically active modes of travel, and they confer significant health benefits that outweigh, in most cases, in almost all cases, the negative impacts from crashes and exposure to air pollution. E-scootering, on the other hand, does not confer those same physical activity benefits, but that's not to say that e-scooting doesn't contribute great benefits in terms of providing a way in which people can live a life in cities and towns and villages with less dependence on cars. They're just different kinds of benefits, not the health benefits that we've highlighted that are linked to the safety question. With that, let's talk about crash risk. Virginia?
A comparative analysis between the years 2022 and 2021 reveals a 26% reduction in the casualty risk of shared e-scooters. Considering that risk is characterized as the road safety outcome of an amount of exposure, such as the distance traveled, the lack of data on micromobility trips, especially for privately owned micromobility, and crashes makes it hard to assess crash risk. So in the next slide, you can see that most incidents involving e-scooters or bikes are non-fatal, resulting in minor injuries. However, a small yet significant portion of these crashes lead to severe injuries, and an even smaller percentage to fatalities. Injury severity is correlated to crash mechanisms, vehicle types, and the road users. Most scooters and bicycle-related crashes involve the rider and no other road user, yet when fatalities do occur, they typically involve a motor vehicle. As you can see in the scene in the next slide, e-scooters riders experience a greater share of head, face, and neck injuries than cyclists, and this difference may partially be explained by significantly lower helmet use among scooter riders or by the higher incidence of alcohol-involved crashes for e-scooter riders. Also, it should be mentioned that lower extremity injuries are more common in scooter riders than cyclists, likely due to scooter riders dismounting during loss of control. George?
Yes, we analyzed the three categories of micromobility crash factors: infrastructure, users, and vehicles. And of course, we have seen that for infrastructure, poorly maintained surfaces with potholes and other irregularities contribute to up to 30 to 40% of e-scooter crashes. And also highlighted the role of dedicated infrastructure. At the next slide, we can see the role of the crash factors of users. Rider-related safety factors associated with bicycles are different to those of e-scooters. With having nighttime and reduced lighting conditions positively correlated with both injury and fatal crashes. Alcohol impairment is a prominent cause of e-scooter riders' injuries. And certainly helmet wearing, even when required by law, it is not used. We have very low levels of usage. And the evidence suggests that while current bicycle helmet standards are generally well adapted to bicycle crashes, they might not provide sufficient protection from face and jaw injuries, which are common for e-scooter crashes. A special issue with e-scooters is tandem riding, contributing to 17% of all e-scooter related casualties. And evidence indicates that 2 to 5% of all observed trips involve two riders on a single e-scooter. And certainly we have seen that experienced and inexperienced riders are linked to a high crash risk. And we might see at the last crash factor, the vehicle, at the next slide, that e-scooters differ greatly in their design, stability, and speed. And we see that the center of gravity, it is much higher in e-scooters than bicycles. Braking, having single front braking only reduces stability in comparison to standard dual mechanical or hydraulic brakes of the bicycles. The wheel size is critical because smaller wheels are more agile and more prone to deflection and stability in comparison to larger cycle wheels. And of course, acceleration, throttle initiated, is much more fast and much more risky than the pedal initiated slower acceleration. Things to consider. And with this, we can go to the next slide, where taking into account all the work and all the analysis of the factors we have come up, we analyzed different suggestions by the authorities and by experts, by operators, and we come up with a synthesis of micromobility safety recommendations, on one hand for public authorities and on the other hand for operators. For safety infrastructure, with focusing on maintenance and dedicated infrastructure. For riders, focusing on the 30 kilometers per hour and low speed limits for scooters. For the vehicles, with universal technical requirements and riding support systems. And for management, of course, data concerning crashes and exposure. So all these are detailed in the report that we suggest you to read and work on.
Thank you very much indeed, Philippe, Virginia, and George, for a very succinct overview of a very complex report and a complex topic. Now, the main aim of our Ask the Author, of course, is to take your questions. Please send in your questions using the Q&A, the question and answer function in the window. That will help us to moderate as many questions as possible. I'm just popping into the chat for everybody the link to the technical report, which provides the empirical evidence that backs up this report, and those who want to take a deeper dive into the analysis can find the further data there. So without further ado, over to your questions. To kick off, we have a technical question from Margaret Wincham, who's from the UK's Parliamentary Advisory Council for Transport Safety, who asks, on the definition of micromobility, what's the justification for limiting maximum weight to 350 kilos, as mentioned in your presentation? Who'd like to take that question?
I can address that. So in the initial work that we did on safe micromobility, we had to find a way to differentiate micromobility vehicles from non-micromobility vehicles, keeping in mind that the micromobility vehicles are going to be lower weight and lower speed than most homologated vehicles. When we get into the heavier vehicles and the faster vehicles, there is, of course, depending on the jurisdiction, homologation that will enter into play. So a vehicle that can travel up to 45 kilometers an hour and 350 kilos in weight will be a homologated vehicle in certain instances and not in others. The first cutoff that we had was based on the risk of a severe injury outcome. That's based on mass and speed, and that was why we had the 25-kilometer cutoff and the 35 kilo weight. The next factor cutoff, or the factor that we used to cut off micromobility as we define it using the safe system approach, was really a factor 10 approach. So we looked at factor 10 increase in the weight, but not for the speed, up to the legal speed for these 45 kilometer an hour vehicles that were more or less in line with mopeds in most of the jurisdictions. So it is not the kind of categorization that we would suggest is one that should be anchored in homologation, but it does provide an understanding of different types of vehicle families and how they might travel and at what speeds they might travel and what weights they are and what the safety impacts would be of those being on the streets.
Thanks indeed, Philippe. Margaret has a follow-up question focusing on wheel size, which is, of course, addressed in this report, and whether the authors would like to comment on what would be a recommended minimum wheel size for relatively easily implementable safer micromobility. This is in a context of increasing potholes and surface defects, which of course contribute to the majority of these crashes.
So George might want to say something about this, but I know that one of the things that we had to address here was what is industry standard practice. And what we do see is that the range of larger wheel size that are being deployed on e-scooters differ. So you have 12-inch, 16-inch, 20-inch, in some cases, wheels. What we will point out that the factor to consider is the angle of attack of the wheel in hitting a forward obstacle. And so while we don't provide engineering guidelines or technical guidelines on what is the right wheel size, we just indicate that a larger wheel and a lower angle of attack is going to lead to greater wheel stability when encountering a straight-on obstacle or a deflective obstacle. And George, is there something else that you might want to bring in on the discussions we had on wheel size?
Yes, both for the wheel size, but also for IRAP and infrastructure assessment, we have to say that we have to evolve. First, we had IRAP for passenger cars, then we developed the cycle RAP, and certainly there is need for an e-scooter RAP, where it takes into account, on one hand, the particularity of the vehicles, I mean the smaller wheels, but on the other hand, it takes into account the relationship and the interaction between the wheel and the infrastructure. So we need a new RAP, and this might be IRAP. It might be also within the initiative of the European Union for network-wide infrastructure assessment, that they are now working on urban assessment framework. So certainly we cannot put them together, and we have to differentiate the network-wide assessment by introducing focused assessment of infrastructure for e-scooters. Then it might be the same infrastructure, but different evaluation assessment for the different types of users, e-scooters or bikes or e-bikes. So certainly there is a need for extra work, and the same applies for the size of the wheel, where we have to work as it has been so far. We go for smaller to larger wheels. Step by step, we see what is better, and that's the reason we need always research to further develop assessment of the infrastructure, assessment of the role of the wheels, and assessment of the interaction between wheels and infrastructure. And this is highlighted in the report, that we need further research based on existing risks and crashes, but also field and laboratory research. So what is the optimum way of interaction between wheel and the different types of maintenance of the infrastructure, dedicated or not?
Thanks indeed, George and Philippe, for those answers. Very pragmatic question from Salvador Saavedra, who asks, which safety gear would you recommend for e-scooter users? Helmet, knee, elbow protection, or something else? And maybe that expands the question about the helmet recommendation into, do we need a more holistic approach to safety? Who'd like to take that question?
I can start with that. And I can say that when we think about safety equipment or safety treatments, the most important safety treatment to improve safety outcomes for micromobility doesn't involve the rider, it doesn't involve the vehicle, it involves the traffic environment. And the danger in the traffic environment comes from large and faster vehicles. So speed management, when there are a lot of micromobility users in a constrained urban space with larger vehicles that are faster as well, speed management is really hidden infrastructure that delivers real safety outcomes. That helps avoid crashes in some cases, but it also avoids the negative outcomes of crashes that you would want protective equipment to help address. Then when it comes to equipment, what we did point out, as George pointed out as well, we note from the injury profile that Virginia was talking about that the facial injuries, maxillofacial injuries, jaw injuries are not currently protected by existing bicycle helmets. It's interesting that in some jurisdictions for the speed e-scooters, but also for the speed e-bikes, that full face helmets or some kind of facial protection helmet is required because those vehicles, especially for the speed ones, fall under moped laws in many jurisdictions. So there's some thinking, as we said, about what is an appropriate helmet for e-scootering use. The rest, knee pads, elbow pads, I think that the kind of injuries that we see that are stemming from those aren't necessarily going to be prevented by protecting your knees or your elbows. It's going to be protection that comes from separation and speed management. That's really focusing on the danger.
Thanks indeed. Salvador's follow-up question is whether we think a recommendation for an NCAP type assessment for different e-scooters would be a useful way to increase safety. NCAP being the recommendation for motor vehicles.
Yes, certainly. As for every type of vehicle on the streets, it could be nice. It takes time to develop the assessment protocols and to work on them, but it is already a lot of work carried out by specific car makers in the field, and we can exploit this also for when assessing e-scooters. A universal standard will be nice to be developed as soon as possible. And on the occasion, I might also provide an answer to Cormac Healy concerning the junctions, were already mentioned by Philippe and pointed out in the report that slower speeds is the key to any safety and to any conflict in junctions. So the 30 kilometers speed limit citywide and special treatments in junctions might lead that even if there is a situation where the different road users have to negotiate, lower speeds allow for less crashes and certainly lower severity for crashes. So junction design, of course, plays a role, and the more a dedicated route is seamless from segments to junction, it is better. Still, the management with lower speeds play a role, at least whenever we don't have dedicated infrastructure.
Thanks indeed, George, and that responds to Cormac Healy's question on how to manage junctions, so speed management being the key there. Very good to see that we have the operators with us as well. So Sebastian Slebusch from DOT makes a comment rather than a question that they have seen no particular difference between their e-scooter fleets in Europe having 11.5 or 12-inch wheels. They haven't seen an injury risk difference between those two wheel sizes. So unless there's a specific
Ronan, could I come in on that? Because
please do, Philippe.
we didn't, it's in the report, it's in the technical report, but I think it's important to say now during this Ask the Author, when we look at the types of vehicles being deployed, the safest vehicles that are being deployed by shared micromobility operators. Those are going to be the ones that have dual braking. Those are going to be the ones that have a lower and more anterior center of gravity. They are going to be heavier. That poses some problems in pedestrian crashes, but generally from a stability perspective for stealth crashes, which are the main issue when it comes to micromobility, it does provide that additional safety. And clearly, as we've heard from Sebastian, they have larger front wheels than those that are commonly available to individuals to purchase. So there is something to be said about looking to how quickly some of these safety improvements can be deployed through the shared fleet as being a harbinger of where the entire fleet should be moving towards.
Thanks indeed, Philippe. Very good. We have time for, I think, a few more questions. Just before we do that, we're going to launch a quick poll to see whether you think these sessions are useful or not. Thank you if you can answer that. Benoit Legardère asks us to detail the data sources used in this study, and also based on that, whether we've been able to differentiate embedded speed limits in some urban areas and their effects on safety.
Concerning the data sources, we have been extensively reviewing the literature on one hand, and then we had quite nice data from operators, which were quite detailed and allowed us to make a proper analysis. Still, we were missing data from private scooters. We do have the official statistics, which are limited. But we also exploited some reports, especially from France and other countries, which have analyzed and provided results. So it was our analysis together with existing analysis of international literature. And there are some studies about embedded safety of speed limits, embedded speed limits. So we have used results from existing literature and find the average values that are reflected in the report. So this is well treated inside the report.
I would like to add 2 points to that to build on what George has just said. The first is that when we look to the data, one of the recommendations is that clearly for individual micromobility, so cycling, e-cycling, and for e-scootering, we need to have greater differentiation when crash statistics are being compiled by police or by health authorities as to what vehicle is concerned. So that is a clear, we can't just treat all of these lighter vehicle crashes as the same. We have to have better understanding of what vehicle was involved. And so that's a clear recommendation that goes with other recommendations in terms of police reporting and health authority reporting of crashes that URTAD, our health and safety body at the ITF has put out in the past. The second thing is, and we noted this in the report as well, when it comes to geofenced, the performance of geofenced speed restrictions for e-scooters and for e-bikes that are commercially shared. we do point out that it is a bit odd that the largest and fastest vehicles that pose the most danger in the system don't have any kind of geofencing, whereas the lightest and smallest vehicles, e-scooters and e-bikes, are the ones that in some cases have been imposed speed restrictions based on geofencing. We show that that's perhaps a misalignment of the measure that's being put into place and where the danger is in the system.
Thanks.
And sorry to add something, if I may. To be more precise, a total of 145 relevant studies were identified in the framework of this report, including peer-reviewed papers and reports from policy organizations, government agencies, and service providers.
Thanks indeed, Virginia. We're at 3 o'clock. We have time for one last question. There's been a lot of changes in legislation since the 2020 report. There's a question on the changes in cities like in Paris that has banned free-floating publicly available scooters. What does this mean for micromobility's future in terms of better transport and better connectivity?
I live in Paris. We followed this. And what I can say is that in France, for example, in 2021, there were about 50,000 shared e-scooters in circulation. That same year, there were 981,000 individually owned scooters that were sold. So addressing the challenges of e-scooters by banning the shared operators doesn't address the safety issue relating to e-scooters. What we say in the report pertains both to shared e-scooters and individually owned e-scooters. But what we can clearly see is that the ratio between shared e-scooters and individually owned e-scooters is changing. There are many more people who own their own devices. And so it is always important to focus on these when you think about the safety recommendations for these, when you think about the future. The future will have a lot more of these vehicles, and depending on the context, some of them will be commercially operated as shared fleets, and many of them will be individually owned. They all have to be safe.
Thank you very much. With that, we'll wrap up. Thank you very much, Virginia, Philippe, and George, for an excellent, rapid overview. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. In the chat, there's ways to stay in touch with the ITF. Do subscribe to our newsletters or follow us on social media. There will be a lot more on this topic. As Philippe said, it's not going to go away. So we're looking forward to seeing it develop in the best way possible. Thank you very much, everybody, and see you soon for our next Ask the Author session.